Sometime you will come face to face with the sudden and shocking realization that you're completely crazy. Your mind is a shrieking, gibbering madhouse on wheels, barreling pell-mell down the hill, utterly out of control and hopeless. No problem. This is from Bunta Gunaratana, from a book he wrote called Mindfulness in Plain English. And it was written a number of years ago. And I do apologize if the language is at all offensive. That's not the intent. But the teaching is so good and so relevant. So I just want to ask you, who can relate to having a wild mind like this? Just give a wave in the window. Right. I mean, I know I can. Some of the things my mind does, it's like, where did that come from? But, you know, more to the point is who can see their wild mind and say, no problem. I'm not going to raise my hand for that. And this is a no problem that's not dismissive, but in a way that reflects a deep sense of equanimity, that's able to watch the mind do all its gyrations and doesn't get drawn in or hooked by it. And maybe it feels compassion for the gymnastics it performs, but it holds it in a balance. What an aspiration. Bhante Ji, as he is called, is a man who's been an ordained monk since he was 12 years old, and he's now 93. So he's had a lifetime of experience to practice. And I think he holds a very deep understanding of himself and his mind to come to this place of no problem. So what is he trying to convey in this teaching? It has to do with an understanding of the self. We speak so often of how when we identify with this egoic sense of self that we constrict, that our heart shuts, and the sense of who we are hardens into something that seems solid and separate. And it's painful. So the question is, what's happening in those moments when the sense of self is felt so strongly? And what's happening when we can say no problem, when we can find equanimity? I wonder if by chance any of you happen to hear Christina Feldman interviewed on the 10% Happier program recently. She speaks of needing to understand the architecture of our experience, to really understand what's happening in the mind as we move into distress and suffering. And conversely, what's happening in the mind when we can rest in peace and happiness? This deeper understanding is what supports us as we practice to ease our suffering. So that's my attempt today, to look at the architecture of how we create a sense of self. Last week, for those of you who were here, Dawn spoke so beautifully of all things being conditioned. When there is this, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. And then when there is not this, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. Everything that arises is dependent on something else. Everything. In the world around us and inside us. We see it in nature, right? In the flower that blossomed because the conditions were right. there was soil, there was enough water, there was sunshine. And then in the bee that's attracted to the flower and unknowingly pollinates other flowers. It's an unending chain of conditioned phenomena. And it's happening inside us as well. Starting from the moment of our birth, which itself occurred because of the right conditions, right? Fertilization and maturity of an egg. And it's reflected in every system in our body. Nothing's exempt. Our heart and mind too. They're also conditioned. It's just a bit harder to see. But every thought, mood, emotion, it's caused by something that has arisen before. This is because of that. So this is where the Buddha's insight and clarity is so genius. He was able to observe the very minute workings of the mind, how it moves from sensory experiences into feelings, moods, thoughts, and stories. And through this process creates a seemingly solid and separate sense of self. So this is how the Buddha describes this process. He does it much more succinctly than I ever could. What we contact, we feel. What we feel, we perceive. What we perceive, we think about. What we think about, we proliferate about. What we proliferate about, we dwell upon. What we dwell upon becomes the shape of our mind. The shape of our mind becomes the shape of the world. So think of this. You walk into a coffee shop to get a cup of coffee and you smell the freshly baked muffins. That smell is so pleasant and it reminds you of your grandmother who would bake for you when you came to visit. That baking was a sign of her love for you, and a story is quickly created about your grandmother, how special you are to her, and your heart is just warmed. It's like in a nanosecond. It all occurs so quickly. Our minds react and they construct stories. So someone else walks into the shop and the smell of muffins reminds them of their grandmother. They wanted a muffin, but were never allowed to have one because they were being saved for special guests. And this person felt unseen and not special and leaves the shop with an ache in their hearts. Different responses to the same sensory experience. And each person created story, created a reality about themselves from the smell of the muffins. We do this all the time. And so the thing is, when we're unaware, we get caught because we believe these stories about ourselves. And this is how the solid, hardened sense of self arises. It's story after story that builds up and defends and justifies and ultimately constricts us. It binds us. And I think every one of us knows how that feels. Can you imagine the discussion that might arise in the coffee shop between the two people that have such different responses to the fresh baked muffins? You know, I know it's a simplistic example, but these stories we create and the self that follows can get us into real trouble. When we see the world in different ways and hold on so tightly to those views because we think they're real, we think they're true, and they reflect who we think we are, the shape of our mind becomes the shape of the world, just like the Buddha said. So, what might it be like to loosen those knots of our sense of self? To let go of our stories a bit and just see more clearly, we are not our thoughts. We are not our stories. The stories are just the gymnastics of the mind. I feel like that's really worth repeating. That is the kernel here. We are not our thoughts and we are not our stories. So for me personally, just knowing intellectually that this sequence of responses outlined by the Buddha occurs, it's helpful to me. Even when I can't follow what my mind is doing, it makes me wonder. And just the possibility opens something in me. So that's why in my meditation practice, sometimes it's interesting to pause when my mind has wandered. And sometimes I wonder, how did I get here? What story is my mind creating? It's informative. It's really hard if we try a little bit more to see this process as it's happening. You know, on retreat, when our minds are particularly quiet, we may catch glimpses, right? A few moments where we can see the process unfolding. And when that happens, it's like, wow, it gives us a deeper understanding and maybe a little faith in the truth of what the Buddha is teaching. And, you know, our minds aren't generally quiet enough, right? We're not on retreat all the time. And so it's hard to see this architecture, as Christina Feldman calls it. And the best advice that I've been given is to just focus on the feeling tone. Focus on the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, which we've talked about here before. To notice how it arises in each moment. And we can begin to see how we like the pleasant and we don't like the unpleasant. And we space out in the neutral. And that's the beginning. This is the building block from which our feelings and stories arise. So if we're willing to see it, what we notice is that our minds are in process all the time, always changing. There is no solid self. There's no need to defend, build up, justify. And that's when we might be able to find some equanimity and just say, no problem. So just for a moment, go back to the story of the two people at the coffee shop and imagine what the conversation could be like with this kind of understanding. The responses to the smells would be the same and the very different stories would remain the same, but the interaction could be so different. Instead of a need to defend the self that arose because there was hurt and sadness, maybe there's room for a more heartfelt response, full of understanding and equanimity, and maybe even compassion or joy. So this is what Bhante G is reflecting. The mind is wild. It's fighting. It's telling stories. It's running pell-mell, one response after another. But because there is no solid self there, there's no problem. It's only this is because of that. And so instead, there's a certain lightness and a sense of heartfulness and a sense of equanimity. I know this is a lot. I feel like I packed a lot into not too many minutes. And I hope it made some sense. If anything landed for you, it's great, but I really don't struggle with it. This is really the work of a lifetime. And so just let it settle a bit.